Buckle up for a journey into one of America's most intriguing upper-crust lives, a story filled with opulent soirees, political dynasties, glittering art collections, and private heartbreak. This is the tale of Betsy Maria Cushing Roosevelt Whitney, a woman who waltzed through the worlds of medicine, politics, and vast wealth, yet managed to keep her own mysteries intact. Born into one kind of privilege and then marrying into an even more famous family, Betsy exemplifies an era where scandal was hidden behind silk curtains, philanthropy was sometimes motivated by social clout, and unwavering composure was the one accessory you could never do without. Betsy arrived in the world on May 18, 1908, in Boston, Massachusetts, the second of the three famed Cushing sisters. Her father was Harvey Cushing, the legendary neurosurgeon who revolutionized brain surgery and whose name still graces medical lectures today. Her mother was Catherine Crewell Cushing, a socially poised matriarch with a discreet but unmistakable presence. Picture the family at tea, father reading the latest medical journal, mother discussing a philanthropic function, Betsy practicing piano under the watchful eye of a governess, while her sisters, Minnie and Babe, run about or dabble in French lessons. This was a gilded bubble of old money refinement, brimming with possibility but also expectation. The Cushing sisters were raised with top-tier education at prestigious institutions like Westover School and Miss Porter's, where the daughters of prominent families were trained not just academically, but in the art of social nuance. Betsy, by all accounts, excelled at both. Growing up, Betsy watched her father's star ascend in the medical community, turning him into a near-mythic figure among the Boston elite. A child of privilege can react to that environment in different ways. Some become bored socialites, others become restless rebels. Betsy carved a third path, always self-possessed, never one for scandal in her early years, but determined to find her own place. While Minnie and Babe would also marry into wealthy, storied families, Betsy's trajectory would soar into the political stratosphere thanks to a fateful meeting with James Jimmy Roosevelt, a man whose last name was about to become synonymous with presidential power. It was 1930. Americans were grappling with the Great Depression, but the Roosevelts were on the cusp of something major. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, was the rising star of the Democratic Party, soon to be elected President of the United States. Amid that swirl of political electricity, Betsy married James, FDR's eldest son, in a lavish wedding. Her new father-in-law was the charismatic New York governor poised for the White House, and her mother-in-law was none other than Eleanor Roosevelt, who would redefine the role of First Lady. Suddenly, Betsy was bridging the genteel Boston aristocracy with the more populist, patrician political class of the Roosevelts. She was only 22, stepping into a future that most society girls could scarcely imagine. FDR's presidency began in 1933, and for a while, Betsy lived at the epicenter of American power, seen at state functions and receiving lines, making polite conversation with visiting dignitaries. But inside the swirl of White House galas and Hyde Park weekends, the first cracks were forming in her marriage to James. He was Harvard-educated, good-looking, with plenty of inherited Roosevelt charm, but he was also a man in a giant shadow, trying to forge his own path. The constant comparison to his father could be oppressive. Some said James chafed at it, and that frustration spilled into his behavior, especially when it came to extramarital pursuits. Then came the rumors. While at the Mayo Clinic for ulcer treatment, James allegedly became romantically involved with a nurse, Romel Schneider. And that wasn't the only whispered liaison circulating in hushed Washington cocktail chatter. Betsy, mortified, did her best to save face. She wasn't about to be the cause of a political embarrassment for the first family, especially not in the throes of FDR's presidency. But by the end of the 1930s, it became impossible to keep up appearances. She was raising two daughters, Sarah, born in 1932, and Kate, born in 1936. Amid the mounting strain of James's infidelity and their mutual clash of ambitions, one can imagine the tension in the private quarters of the White House or in their separate lodging as the stony silences gave way to hushed arguments about trust, betrayal, and the pressures of living in history's spotlight. By 1939, Betsy had had enough. In an era when divorce was still scandalous, she summoned the courage to file, aiming to finalize it in Reno, Nevada. The news broke in 1940, during FDR's second term, ensuring a deluge of headlines. But ironically, the Roosevelt clan handled this family drama with the same meticulous care they devoted to politics. Eleanor used her famed poise to help manage the public image, never openly condemning Betsy, and skillfully directing the press toward a narrative of mutual respect, even though behind-the-scenes heartbreak and anger abounded. As if that wasn't traumatic enough, Betsy's personal universe was further shattered by the death of her father, Harvey Cushing, on October 7, 1939. She was just 31, deep in the throes of the divorce process, and suddenly lost her greatest emotional rock. The mighty neurosurgeon revered by colleagues and revered by Betsy passed away due to a heart attack while lifting a heavy book at Yale. The paternal anchor who had offered her stability through the fiasco of James's affairs was gone. That day in New Haven, as she reportedly kept vigil by his bedside, something in Betsy shifted. Without her father to confide in, she had to navigate the humiliations of divorce and the complexities of single motherhood on her own. The divorce became official in 1940. She walked away from the Roosevelts with two young daughters and a bruised public reputation, yet at the same time, she retained a certain dignity. She was still Betsy Cushing after all, with formidable connections and enough resilience to shape a new chapter. That fresh start came surprisingly soon, and it raised more than a few eyebrows among the social set. In 1942, Betsy married John Hay Whitney, Jock to friends, one of the richest men in America. In fact, rich might be an understatement. The Whitneys were old guard American royalty, with vast holdings in finance, publishing, horse racing, and more. Jock himself was a diplomat, a publisher. He owned the New York Herald Tribune at one point, and an aficionado of art. With this marriage, Betsy leaped from the political sphere into the plush realm of big league money and aristocratic respectability. Some in high society gossiped that she had traded up, using her Roosevelt name to secure an even more spectacular fortune. Others saw it as a true love match that offered Betsy the stability she'd never found with James. Whichever interpretation you favor, the fact remains that Jock Whitney catapulted Betsy into a stratosphere of luxury that eclipsed anything she'd known before. Still, any illusions that her second marriage would be free from scrutiny were dashed quickly. Jock had only just divorced his first wife, Mary Elizabeth Altimus, in 1940, which meant there wasn't exactly a long gap between the end of that relationship and his courtship of Betsy. The timing, plus Betsy's own fresh divorce, gave gossip columnists plenty of material. Yet this union, compared to her first, remained free of large-scale scandal. No glaring infidelities made the papers, no messy financial fiascos. By all accounts, Betsy and Jock were well-matched in temperament and interests. She channeled her refined taste into collecting art with him, eventually amassing works by Picasso, Monet, Van Gogh, and others. Their combined philanthropic endeavors also expanded. They financed museum wings, donated paintings, and made substantial gifts to major cultural institutions, including the National Gallery of Art and the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. When you think of mid-century American philanthropy, the type that built modern art collections and shaped how Americans viewed culture, you can place the Whitneys right at the center. In those 1940s and 1950s, Betsy also cultivated her public image more carefully. Gone were the days of tabloid speculation about a first family divorce. Instead, she was recognized as a style icon, a mainstay on the international best-dressed list, lauded for an effortless elegance that had no trace of the old scandal. People who remembered her from her Roosevelt days might have noticed that she'd grown more adept at maneuvering in lofty social circles, less naive, more polished. She did volunteer work, serving as a nurse's aide during World War II, an effort that resonated with a sense of civic duty that many upper-class women adopted during the conflict. Later, when Jock Whitney became the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom between 1957 and 1961 under President Eisenhower, Betsy was briefly his special assistant, stepping into a diplomatic role that required tact, intelligence, and that unflappable grace she was known for. Diplomacy suited her refined manner. Britain's aristocracy, after all, wasn't so different from Boston's or New York's old money circles, just with more formal titles. Yet behind every glamorous facade can lurk heartbreak and unresolved tension. Betsy's father was gone, but she still had her daughters, Sarah and Kate, whose paternal side was the Roosevelt Dynasty, a family that shaped American politics for generations. For Sarah, the eldest, life turned out to be complicated. In 1951, Sarah married Anthony de Bonaventura, a gifted pianist in what might have seemed like a union between a cultured daughter of privilege and a talented musician. But the marriage ended in divorce in the 1960s amid whispers of financial troubles and personal discord. Betsy watched from the sidelines, seeing her daughter wrestle with a crumbling union that, in certain ways, echoed her own experiences with James. Meanwhile, Betsy's sister Babe, officially Barbara Cushing, who was married to William S. Paley of CBS fame, died of lung cancer in 1978. That was yet another blow. Babe's journey had paralleled Betsy's in many respects. Both had soared among the social elite, had high-profile marriages, and cultivated an image of refined glamour. But Babe's passing stripped Betsy of a dear confidant, leaving her even more aware that behind the banquets and philanthropic events, mortality and sadness patiently hovered. As the years rolled on, Betsy became something of a discreet power broker, hosting dinners where politicians, celebrities, and fellow philanthropists mingled. She continued to wear impeccable clothing and rarely indulged in public drama. This was her brand, a quiet but formidable presence, someone who had walked away from a fractured marriage with a famous presidential heir and found lasting security with an American tycoon. She wasn't the type to grant messy interviews or publish memoirs. Her style was always more of a softly closed door, letting the world assume what it would. Jock's wealth kept them living in a realm above everyday concerns. They owned a 400-acre estate on Long Island, known as Green Tree, where they bred horses, entertained international guests, and strolled among carefully manicured gardens that rivaled any royal palace. Jock Whitney died in 1982 at age 77, felled by a heart attack. Betsy, who had thus far led a life shaped by a father's sudden death, a humiliating divorce, and the subsequent joy of a stable but scrutinized second marriage, now found herself a widow, rumored to be worth $700 million in 1980s money. She was 74, alone except for her older friends and family, and she had to manage the colossal Whitney estate and philanthropic legacy Some people in her position might have retreated from public engagements altogether. Betsy chose a middle path, still philanthropic, still present, but quieter. She no longer had her husband by her side to co-host events or champion the arts with her, so she continued under her own name, spending money on hospitals, medical research, perhaps in homage to her father's vocation, and further donations to Yale. If the world expected her to cause a stir with sensational new romances or shocking confessions, it never got it. Betsy had learned the art of discreet living all too well. By the 1990s, Betsy's life had spanned eras: the Great Depression, World War II, the transformation of American society in the 1960s, and on into the modern age of tabloids and cable news. Throughout, she remained that figure of controlled composure. Nonetheless, the toll of aging caught up with her. She was a heavy smoker for much of her life, a habit that was once considered fashionable but turned out to have dire health consequences. The official cause of her death was respiratory failure linked to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. In her last days, she stayed at her beloved Green Tree Estate on Long Island. On March 24, 1998, her breathing became alarmingly labored, and she was rushed to North Shore University Hospital. By March 25th, she'd slipped into a coma and passed away, ending a life that, for all its privileges, had not been immune to heartbreak or sacrifice. She was 89 at the time of her death, a remarkable age for someone of her generation, but not surprising given her family's general longevity and the top-tier medical care she had always known. If you're picturing a grand funeral swarmed by paparazzi, think again. In typical Betsy fashion, the service at St. James Episcopal Church in Manhattan was private, low-key, and draped in tasteful mourning. She was laid to rest next to Jock in Laurel Hollow Cemetery, completing that circle of wealth, grace, and quiet finality. In the days that followed, obituaries praised her as an art patron, a philanthropic dynamo, and a scion of two major American families: Boston's eminent Cushing lineage and the legendary Roosevelts, plus, of course, the astronomical influence of the Whitneys. But these tributes often glossed over the storms that had marked her early years. For most casual observers, Betsy was simply an elegant icon of old money who had never caused much fuss. And yet beneath that carefully curated image, there was a woman whose life had intersected some of the greatest forces of the 20th century. A father who transformed neurosurgery. A father-in-law who steered America through the Great Depression and World War II. A second husband who shaped publishing and diplomacy. And siblings who each grabbed a slice of the social limelight. Betsy's own narrative was peppered with tragedies that tested her resolve. Her father's death in the midst of her divorce, her first husband's very public infidelity, culminating in a humiliating break, the heartbreak of seeing her daughter Sarah endure a similar pattern of marriage and divorce, the passing of her sister Babe, with whom she had formed a special bond that only sisters in high society could fully comprehend, and in the end, the quiet, lonely years of widowhood in an enormous estate filled with priceless paintings, but missing the person she'd built that life with. Was Betsy purely a privileged socialite, gliding on inherited wealth and connections? Or was she a self-made figure in some respects, forging a new identity after each life upheaval and channeling her resources into philanthropic causes? Both can be true. Her parents' position put her at the starting line far ahead of most, but her personal trials forced her to develop emotional resilience. In the public eye, she was the essence of polished composure, never a tear streaking her mascara, never a meltdown in the tabloids, never an unhinged diary entry leaked to the press. In private, one can only imagine the tears she might have shed over her father's bedside, or the rage she might have felt learning that James was cheating, or the heartbreak of losing her beloved Jock to a sudden heart attack. That first big scandal, her divorce from FDR's son, was overshadowed by the grandeur of the Roosevelt presidency, but it could have derailed her socially if not for the steady guidance of her father and her own measured fortitude. In that moment, it's easy to see how she might have become cynical, concluding that marriage was a sham. Instead, she chose to place her faith in Jock Whitney, a man who, by all accounts, adored her and gave her a stable partnership. The transition from political scion's wife to tycoon's consort might have felt abrupt to onlookers, but it actually followed a certain logic in the rarefied circles Betsy inhabited. She had grown up in an environment where marrying a figure of power was practically expected. Perhaps it's no surprise that her second marriage lasted decades and ended only with his death. There's another angle to Betsy's life that often gets overlooked: her experience as a mother. With the Roosevelt girls, Sarah and Kate, she had to maintain a delicate balance of letting them see their renowned grandparents, FDR and Eleanor, while also forging a new identity once she married Jock. Did Sarah and Kate feel overshadowed by the storied Roosevelt name or the immense Whitney wealth? Did Betsy encourage them to live more grounded lives, or did she push them toward the same social circles that had defined her own youth? These questions linger around the edges of her story. We know that Sarah's adulthood was marked by personal struggles, ending in 1999, just a year after Betsy's death. Sadly, Betsy wasn't there to witness that final heartbreak, but one wonders if she sensed that Sarah's path was troubled. Kate, less public, seemed to avoid the limelight, perhaps a wise strategy for someone carrying two famous family names. Another emotional pivot point in Betsy's life must have been the tension between her and the broader Roosevelt clan after the divorce. Eleanor Roosevelt was famous for her progressive stances, but her personal relationships weren't always straightforward. How did Eleanor view Betsy once James's infidelity became undeniable? There's evidence that Eleanor maintained a cordial front, even supporting Betsy in certain philanthropic endeavors. Yet the internal strain must have been immense, especially given how the Roosevelts prized family unity as part of their public persona. Betsy herself rarely spoke publicly about that transitional period. In her own brand of high society discretion, she left behind no sensational interviews or confessional memoirs. She was no Wallace Simpson broadcasting her side of the story to the press. Instead, she carried on as though this was simply the next step in her life's journey. Betsy Cushing Roosevelt. Whitney's life was a masterclass in resilience. She rose through society's ranks, survived personal heartbreaks, and left behind a philanthropic legacy that still touches institutions today. Though her name may not be as instantly recognizable as others in her orbit, her impact was profound and her story unforgettable. What do you think of Betsy's life journey? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found her story as compelling as we did, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more fascinating histories of those who lived extraordinary lives behind closed doors. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.